So they're based in New York City, and they do generative AI education software focused on providing institutions like Kaplan, Syracuse University, NVIDIA, Fordham, and many others with complete and total ownership over their AI agents and mentors. I know that certainly intrigued me, and I wanted to hear more about that. And then Jeremy Weaver, who was just recently Penny Evans Plants on the Zoom call, is a partner manager and higher ed AI specialist at IBL, where he works with university faculty to develop and deploy custom AI mentors that meet institutional education goals. So I know you want to kick off the session with some answers and responses that we share in the webinar.
Yep.
So I'm going to turn it over to you two.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, Don, for introducing us in the in the first place.
Of
And
course.
let's see. So, do you guys have any? Is there any background noise here or?
Yeah, I'm muting now. So give me a sec.
Okay. Okay, sounds good. So,
Right.
so yeah, so we're based here in New York. We're a family-owned company. So Hayone, the other person who joined on our end, she's my sister and an engineering manager on our end as well, right?
Hello.
And so basically, we're gonna be talking and very much with a lot in common, done from what we heard with CUNY and with City Tech. It's really just a way for colleges and really of all sizes, right, to be able to own their generative AI, right? Because it's kind of funny and interesting, right, that on one hand this is being touted as something that is almost forcefully transformative, right, and across tutoring, across advising, across content creation, and so on, right? But then on the other end, let's just say that you say, okay, well, fair enough, let's try it out. Well, it's very expensive, right, and very constrained, right, because you can't just say, okay, well, let's go to OpenAI's $20 per user per month, right? So on one hand, oh, it's you need to do this right now. I mean, this is changing everything. Everything it's a huge before and after, biggest change in education, and so on. On the other hand, you don't really have a lot of choices. Like the default choice is, $20 per user per month, right? Or if you go to Microsoft Copilot, $30 per user per month. And the alternative is, shrug, right? I mean, what is it? So that's kind of the world and the space that we are in. So on one hand, and intending to make this very very interactive, and I have access to the chat here constantly. So if you would like, to jump in or to even message or any other point that you would like to go over, then I'll be able to see the chat here on another screen. So with that, we can get started. So we have this basically this imperative, right, and this mission, right, that colleges and educators, right, should be in charge of their generative AI, insofar as it applies to tutoring, to content creation, advising, any of the above. Okay, it's tremendously important, and there is a distinction between engineers, right, who can build applications and websites, and we'll go into why that's necessary, versus the educators, right? Like, I am an engineer personally. I do not know, how to educate second-year students on any subject, right, or students from any other year in any subject. So it's important that we kind of, know our place, and that we can provide colleges with the means to break out of this, let's say, perceived monopoly that's out there. Okay, and the perceived monopoly that we're going to be talking about, it's going to sound like I'm a little bit picking on OpenAI, but they are the most prominent player, right, across the field. So that's why they're getting picked on. They'll be fine. Okay, but the case with OpenAI, right? So let's say you have, okay, well, $20 per user per month, right? That's the price that you're quoted, right? And you say, okay, well, I have, so many hundreds, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of students. Well, what's the price? I mean, if you say, well, what's the price for, let's say, 5,000 students? 20 times 12 times 5,000. Well, that's $1.2 million a year, right? And with this, what do you get access to? So you get access to OpenAI's models. So, well, what about Gemini, right? Because you have Gemini is interesting, right? Google is, because they control their own hardware. They're not as dependent on like the NVIDIA infrastructure, for example. They have their own TPU. So Google has some interesting things to say as well, right? And Gemini is interesting. Well, what about that? Say, well, no. If you're in the OpenAI ecosystem, you're not getting anything from Google, right? What about Claude, right? What about Anthropic? Say, well, that's also another company, right? So you're not really getting that either. So, well, what do you get here? It's well, you get access to ChatGPT licenses for the students. Okay. So you have on one hand an arms race, across LLM companies, right? Because you have OpenAI punching up, right? Gemini, Copilot, Meta. Meta's, very interesting, right? And you say, well, if I have that, then why can I take advantage, right, of whatever is the best price, right? Because whenever I'm looking for an LLM, there's a huge disparity, right? And there's a reason as to why you may want to hop around different LLMs, and you may want to hop around different stacks. This is, for example, a little spreadsheet here, which is for a simulation where you may have, I don't know, 50 students, 50 messages per student per week. And let's say you have, 23,000 students. Huge, let's say it's a very blown up number. Obviously, we can change this to any number that we want. Let's just make it, for the sake of the example, let's say 5,000. Say, well, if you are aware of the fact that these LLM companies are kind of competing with each other in a way that, for a lot of our purposes, is, let's say, tutoring, and we'll go into that in a second, is effectively commoditized, then you should be able to hop around, right? You should be able to say, okay, well, if these things is commoditized, why am I being given monopoly pricing, right? Why do I pay OpenAI's $20 per user per month if OpenAI's and Gemini's and Anthropics and so on are commoditized, especially for the tutoring example? So you want to be able to hop around. And this is just a pricing argument to support that statement, okay? Because if you have, let's say, 50 messages per student per week, and let's just say 5,000 students, okay? Well, if you use Gemini 2.5 Flash, your LLM fees are $1,500 per year, right? Which is not big, right? If you are using, let's say, OpenAI GPT 4.1, for the same estimate, you're going to be paying $30,000 a year, right? You use Claude Opus, well, you're paying $189,000, right? So there's a big disparity. And when you are out here picking a language model, well, then, obviously pricing is a variable, right? Pricing, reasoning capabilities, and so on. And if you can sit on top and say, okay, when might I have to choose one LLM versus another, right? When may I need higher reasoning capabilities versus when may I not need them? Because if you don't need high reasoning capabilities for some applications, let's say like with Forum here, for example, we have something that is, you can ask it questions, right, about Fordham University, and that's great, right? This is not a tremendously, complex task from a reasoning standpoint. Well, if you are teaching pre-calculus, then you do have that, that prerequisites, right? So you want to be able to hop around. You want to be able to say, okay, well, I'm going to be sitting on top, picking, okay, the best LLM that is useful for each task. In other words, the cheapest possible LLM that will get the job done, okay? And that's the pricing motivator. Okay, what's another motivator as to why you should be more in control? Okay, because we understand the urgency. Yes, OpenAI is great for tutoring, right? 24/7 tutors. It's going to be more available than any TA. And maybe it's not able to handle all of the tasks perfectly, but it can address a big percentage of the questions on a 24/7 basis. So that's useful in and of itself. Like, I buy that it's useful, great. From a pricing standpoint, I understand that I should not be locked into OpenAI's whenever, there's an arms race and you have multiple people sort of navigating this as best as they can. So now, well, what other arguments are there, right? And I'm going to send you here a link in the chat. This is Jeff Rubin. So we work for them, where they're of Syracuse University, their campus platform. And this video is he's talking about this, right? He's talking about this in a much more eloquent way than I am doing, right? But he's talking about the reluctance to pick a horse so early on in this race, right? All the LLMs are in a race, and he's like, why should I pick a horse so early on in the race? It's like, well, you shouldn't, and and there's that. So there's the pricing argument, and we can we can keep going, right? There is the other one is a very, very serious one is the data privacy and ownership argument, right? When you have, well, let's say you have your model of your students, right? Where you are pedagogically in the best place, right? To reach those students, right? Because it's not just about, delivering and communicating information. It's also about the motivation, right? And everything from a pedagogical and educational standpoint that you know better than I do. That can get complicated if you start having mentors and agents that rely on user memory. Okay. And memory is something that is going to be talked about much more as the months go by. Okay. Because these companies, like, it's not some big revelation, right? That Gemini and OpenAI and so on are in an arms race against each other. So you say, okay, so where else can they take over in the stack, right? Like, what is the next phase in order to differentiate themselves, right? So a huge part of that is memory, the user memory. This is why you see headlines about OpenAI building, social networks, right? Because, and this is why you see browsers, right, increasingly incorporating this AI, because they understand that the greatest moat, if anybody can have a moat in these times, right, it's the greatest moat that can be is going to be with the memory of the user, right? If some LLM or some model already knows me, let's say that in a creepy way, but let's just say they already know my preferences and kind of what I look for and so on, well, then I'm more likely to go to it, right? So the memory is the next layer, right? And OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, etc., they're each doing what they can in order to bubble up in that importance of that memory. So it means that left unchecked, you would have, let's say, OpenAI develop a greater understanding of your students than you. Okay, so OpenAI having a much more thorough memory, right, for each of your students than you. And that is going to affect that, that could have implications, right, for the students while they are enrolled, but also after they enroll, and, for forever, right? And if OpenAI knows your students better than you do, then, well, that's kind of weird, right? And ethically and so on is one thing, right? But from a utility standpoint, that is, that's another one. So what we're saying is, okay, well, maybe you should own the memory layer of your students, okay? Because, first of all, it's not that difficult, right? If you are already an application that sits on top and you can consume different LLMs, like the same faucet can consume different types of water, right? Because you could just, I don't know, kind of hard to switch the water at home, right? But you can use the same faucet, right, to consume different types of waters, right, from all kinds of cities. Okay, it could be the same faucet. So that's what you should be. Now, if you can do that, then you can retain control over that memory layer yourself. And whenever you want to delegate it to, okay, OpenAI, sure, process something with these memories, or Google, or Microsoft, or Meta. Okay, that's fine. But you are the ones who own that memory and own that user data. Okay? So everything here is sort of building up to why you should have, let's say, your own application or a greater degree of control than the status quo is pushing right now. Status quo is saying, okay, OpenAI, $20 per user per month, but that's bad from a pricing standpoint. It's bad from a data ownership and memory standpoint as well. So we can keep going, right? I mean, there's another argument to you owning your infrastructure, which is, well, if you have these kinds of applications running within your secure environments, you don't have to, let's say, sync your registrar data with OpenAI or with another LLM vendor, right? That's kind of strange, right? You're not going to say, oh, well, a student came in, let me just sync that over. And you're like, okay, well, we have some enterprise agreements, right? People are promising to not do, weird things. Well, every one of those is an extension and a variation of Trust Me, Bro. You know what is the real Trust Me, Bro? Is when it's running in your infrastructure and you don't see any internet packets going outside, right? That is, supreme data ownership. So, and that can be, by the way, in your Microsoft environment, in your GCP, in your AWS, right? But the point is that the LLM layer is not the cloud layer. Okay, so if you have, let's say your LLM's running right within your cloud, if you have an LLM from Vertex, for example, it's like, well, that's governed by your existing agreement with GCP, right? Or with Azure. It's like, well, that's governed by your existing agreement with Microsoft. Same thing applies to Amazon. But it's not, that is, you're still operating within your environment, right? You're not syncing over your most secure data over to an LLM company. Okay, so this is the ownership, right? And now we're making basically the case to youth, right? To the leaders, right? From an institutional standpoint. Okay, this is the first layer. Now we can go into, well, what's the argument from a pedagogical standpoint, right? For the professors and then for the students. Does anybody have any comments or any point about this? We can say it if you want it out loud or in the chat, whatever is helpful. Like any point of that you think it's like, oh, that's a pretty weak argument. What do you think? I don't know if asking like, what do you think to a forum with so many people is kind of a wise question to ask. So but we can continue. So, okay, from the next standpoint, right? The next persona is, well, the faculty. Okay, so we, there is a very important point, right? Which is one that sort of everyone who's serious about the matter makes, which is, this is not replacing professors. It's not replacing faculty. Okay, because the faculty does much more, right, than what is encompassed by a conversational search engine, which is really what we're talking about here. Okay, so the one analogy that is always kind of interesting is, for example, Chipotle, right? So Chipotle, they used to have, and Jeremy on our end here used to work at Chipotle, right? But Chipotle had people spending thousands of hours per location just cutting avocados, okay? And that was replaced last year by something called the Autocado, okay? And the Autocado was a machine that just, took care of, breaking up these avocados, right? It went from thousands of hours to like 20 seconds. Now, that is basically what we're doing, right? We're finding avocados. That allowed Chipotle employees to spend more time with the customers and, to do other parts of the job that overall increase satisfaction and, productivity and so on. Okay, but when it comes to sort of the next part of the conversation, right, the faculty is, well, we're finding avocados. Okay, so let's see. Okay, and before we continue to talk about the faculty, I would say, okay, so let's see, or allow Chipotle employees to lose their jobs. So far, Corinne, so at least in my knowledge, and I don't have access to the internal records. From what I understand, those employees did not lose their jobs from there. But for the first question, what do you think the consequences are of outsourcing some of this mentoring, connective labor to bots instead of humans within the institution? We know for sure that the predominant use of these tools among students is a kind of relational, almost therapeutic application. I mean, so I'm curious to hear if you feel like this application of bots degrades interactive mentoring. So I would say, I mean, from my standpoint, if this bot saves me from spending my time wading through PDF files, right? Because I can just ask a question easily, right? And this can give me a response that's sort of anchored in the data, then I do like it, right? So for example, let's say here, right, I have this class, this epidemiology class, right? And I can ask a question and I can get an answer, and that answer is constrained within the, allowed data from the instructors, then I think that is useful. Now, let's say I ask an answer, I get a question, I get a response, and that response says, okay, well, drew my information from these documents and these presentations that are part of the class notes, right? That's fine, right? So if I want to learn more about this topic, then I'm going to go and open this PowerPoint that contains more sessions. This is not, I don't think this is, I think this is productive. It's not really threatening, right? Because it really is just basically adding a pretty smart search engine to a trove of documents and data. Okay. Now, if I have continuous questions, okay, it's helpful that I don't have to wait until Thursday at 3 p.m., which is when the TA is available, right, to ask a question, right? I can just ask it on the spot. I think that's okay. And I think that enhances, right, this kind of, well, let's say the access from the students. So if it's beyond this, right, I would not expect really the mentors to increase my passion for the field necessarily. I mean, that only is true insofar as I can get answers to my questions more quickly. So maybe in times where I happen to be more motivated or available, I can dive more deeply into the material. So insofar as that's true, yes. But from a mentoring standpoint, I think, it really depends, right? If this is the part that we're focusing on, then yes. If it's something that is much, much deeper and much more emotional, then not so much. And I hopefully that answers the question. But yeah, that's fair enough. So you're saying when we say mentor, when we talk about AI mentor, that's what we named our platform, frankly, because we thought this would be, from an educational agent standpoint, that mentor would sort of capture things well, right? But still mentor AI mentor, right? Which is, performs maybe a small subset of what a human would perform. It's a little bit different, right? But that's it. When you look at other things like advising, because it's not just tutoring, it's not just answering questions like this. You could also, we have, for example, a university that, has thousands of courses, thousands of students, and there, those are many permutations, right? For the very few human advisors to provide actionable advice to each individual student. So you say, okay, is this mentor taking care of advising? Say, well, let's just say that whenever it can, what is the status quo, first of all? Kind of like, what is the degree? Are we comparing this to an ideal that is actualized, or are we comparing this to the actual state, which is, well, there are few advisors, very unlikely that the few advisors understand the histories of each student and the motivations is deep personally, just frankly, because there's no time. So if this can provide sort of these recommended pathways more easily and flag the students who are under, tougher circumstances for the human advisors, then that's great, right? And that's the other part where this mentoring comes in. But that's sort of how we see that from that standpoint. It does seem to be productive. We have, and this is not on a study level, this is not a study level analysis, right? But with some folks from, let's say, Kaplan and so on, we've seen that the engagement and performance in many cases has doubled, right? So you're like, okay, well, why is that? So, well, part of that is probably just the convenience, right? But that is helpful. Okay, so zooming, okay, so does your platform work with other OpenAI API models? So yes, because the way that we think you should have kind of this control over the application layer in an LLM agnostic way is we should be basically a connector. And if I say we, so, you can create an application like this yourself, okay? But I'm saying whoever is sort of in this position who says, okay, I'm going to own the application stack, say, well, you don't want to be in a game where you're competing with OpenAI or you're not competing with Google and Microsoft and so on. That's a crazy game, right? Because you're not, unless you have, billions to shell out, that's not going to be a productive one. Instead, you want to be a connector, right, to all of them. So it means OpenAI implements something in their API or their SDK, great. Microsoft does it, great. You can consume everything because what you're doing is you're sitting on top as a layer of abstraction over all these possible backends. So that's sort of where we stand. So OpenAI releases anything in terms of they have the LLMs, right? But then they release kind of through their SDK, right? The MCP tools, right? Additional moderation tools and so on. You say, great, no problem, because your API and your SDK is taking care of it, which means that my layer of abstraction on top, which if we build this well, it's a thin layer on top, which means it does take that, right? But now Google, when they release something great as well, you can also integrate that, right? When Microsoft does the same thing, and different people have different reasons, but that's kind of what that's kind of what's happening. So David, hopefully that was a good answer to your question. And Donald, so some of the most effective strategies you've seen for building faculty confidence and integrating AI tools in the classroom. So this, what we've seen works really well is, first of all, but listen to their concerns. Okay, and I'm all right. I'm gonna try to say something that doesn't sound like just obvious statements, right? That anybody else would make, right? But listening to concerns is actually quite helpful, right? Because sometimes there are so there are kind of the concerns that are spoken out loud in a call, especially these calls that tend to be with a lot of folks at the college and so on. And then there are the underlying concerns that are not spoken about. Like, is this going to make me lose my job? Right? That's an unspoken concern, right? Versus, well, what features are there for, controlling the system or the pedagogy and so on. So we find that it's pretty helpful to first saying, okay, if this is going to start with a very simple case, because you could have agents that sort of route all sorts of queries all over the place and so on, and that can be pretty complex, right? You can start finding all kinds of avocados at the college, yes. But one very obvious case is, let's use, have a tutor if you want with any number of your class notes, okay? And your learners can ask you questions 24/7. That is, from a standpoint of kind of jumping into this, a lot more accessible than, you can have agents that sort of replace all kinds of functions. Like, nobody understands what that means. But something that you could say, okay, you can load, if you want, your PDFs, you can load your textbooks, and then you have a search engine over that. That seems to be, quite accessible. And if we say, okay, well, that's what we're going to do. Now, what if that's sort of the premise, right? So then what are the concerns? So, well, the concerns are on two extremes, right? One extreme is that I'm not going to have any control over this, right? And it's going to indeed like make me irrelevant because I have no control over this. Okay. And that's a little bit what happened with the Canmigo stuff in like Newark public schools. This is kind of when this first started to get more popular, right? But if you see, I mean, this was back in the day, right? But back in the day, as in, a couple of years ago, right? So back in the day, right? But the criticism originally was that people were saying, okay, well, I don't really have control over the prompts, over the pedagogy. Therefore, I don't like it, right? I don't have control over it. I'm afraid of it in the first place, and I don't like it. Okay, you can go on the other pole, which is, this is technically complex. I don't really want to have another job to do, right? And this is overwhelming. So I don't really like that either, right? So there's a perpetual balance, right, between control and the features that you have access to and so on, versus don't overwhelm me, don't give me more work to do. I already have a lot of stuff to do. I'm not trying to learn another platform. So that is the other piece of the onboarding, right? So let's just say, okay, tutoring, easy enough, right? You're just going to upload your notes and the students are going to have a conversational search engine over your notes. Okay. 2 is, how do you have control without it being overwhelming? The same way that your phone works, right? You get your phone, right? And your phone works out of the box. Like, you can go and be a power user and go in the settings and start modifying stuff, and that's good, but you don't have to do it. Okay. By default, if modifying the system prompts, like, so pedagogically, it's interesting, right? If you want to say, okay, well, I'm going to be specifying my pedagogy here and so on. Okay, great. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. But if you are a power user, you have the means to do it. Now, this is that. And then, when we onboard or when we, I don't know, it's kind of I don't know what the term is, right? But when first with a college, we'll say, okay, let's do training sessions, right? Let's do training sessions, and people can ask questions in an open forum. But then, equally importantly, let's do one-on-one sessions, right? Because sometimes people don't want to ask a question out loud that sort of hits at a core concern, right? For whatever other reasons they may have. So collective sessions, sure. right? And for many people, that's fine, but also individual one-on-one sessions, okay? And in those, well, we got, you know, all kinds of questions right here, from questions about the larger ecosystem, like what's the difference between NVIDIA and TSMC, for example. I mean, just unrelated to the mentors in a way, but it is relevant to sort of, you know, these terms and buzzwords and so on that are thrown around. And then answering questions that come up, right? So how can I use this? Can you have a specific feature or a specific something else, right? And that's really the answer, right? Is to start with a relatively easy to understand use case, which is tutoring, and two, you know, fantastic onboarding, which includes the human. Okay, it's funny, we're an AI company, but this has to be human. All right, this is the training sessions, and then that could be collective, but also the one-on-one sessions. Okay, and at that point, you sort of see, well, let's just say a lot of questions get answered, and this is the, so I don't know, Don, if this answers the question a little bit. We've seen that this is quite successful.
Yeah, it's a great quote. Yeah, it answers it definitely. And I just want to lift up Matthew's question because it's really good in the
Awesome.
chat.
Okay. Wouldn't students be wary of using an in-house AI for fear their queries are being recorded and associated with them? That is a great question. So we actually, all right, so this is, let's say, since recent events with, let's say, you know, Columbia among others, we actually had that exact request of saying, okay, well, you have to disable chat histories, right, for certain classes, because if you don't disable chat histories, the students will, exactly, you're right, the students will just not do, they won't do any, they won't participate, right, because of fear that this will be, you know, that this will come back to haunt them. So for sure, that is something that we like to leave that honestly in the hands of the faculty and the hands of the administrators, right? So you decide if it's something that you want, if it's something that you want to say, okay, well, we're going to be tracking this history and so on, and we're going to use this to sort of look at the student submissions so we can see what your questions are, so we can, you know, insert them into the next lecture or something, okay? Or if you want to have the kind of classroom, right, where that is not tracked, then that's okay. Generally, with these questions, it's a little bit similar to the safety questions. We, you know, we are engineers, right? And like, that's it, right? We prefer to say, you know, here's a text form where you can define your own layers of moderation and security, okay? And you can define kind of what is an acceptable behavior or not an acceptable behavior. And our job is really just to make sure that, first of all, this form works, and that when a student sends a message through the chat, that your concerns will be applied right here. Okay, so this control cannot be sort of centralized at the engineering or provider level in this case, right? This goes back to you, and, you know, easy enough. It's configurable options. So that is the, Matthew. Hopefully that's a good answer. I think that's very, you know, very common and very timely. And so reading Matthew White's, I think that, yeah, that's perfect. I mean, the replacing employees, that narrative, I mean, it doesn't seem to be, we at least have not seen that, right? And it doesn't seem to be the case that, let's say, if a student has kind of a chat interface over documents, like there's a quote from a professor who's a, you know, very close friend of ours at George Washington University, who says, I did not become a professor so that I could answer your questions about the syllabus, right? Like, answering questions about the syllabus is not sort of her main mission as the professor. Likewise, you know, doing a chat interface over the PDF notes that she shared the previous week, not the main mission either. So that's when somebody talks about, oh, well, now the professor's going to be replaced, then there are a lot of holes there that I don't really think anybody has any sort of answers about. Not even morally, but let's just say practically. It's just, it doesn't seem to be there. Now for, and yeah, and like the comments are saying, so there are other people in this space, right, that are trying to, and you know, that are doing something like this, and it's very good, right? Because ultimately, if you can have, as a college, a setup where you say, okay, well, I'm going to have this ownership, And if, we, at least with our partners, we give them the entire code. Okay. So if their own IT folks and engineers want to create additional web applications or anything like that using the same backend, because really we think that we have to be a developer product fundamentally for this, then they can. So that's why we say, okay, we'll give you the code. It's all going to be running in your systems and so on. And it's going to also contain, it's going to be built on top of an LMS in a way, right? And this is important because when you are creating AI agents and so on for education, if you can piggyback, right, on existing systems, let's just say you have an agent for course creation. All right, you have let's say the instructor creates a course and you say, well, the AI created a course. That's it. And the instructor's like, well, cool, can I modify it and so on? It's like, well, it's a little bit of a black box. That's not really a great answer. Whereas if you say, okay, the AI creates a course, but here's the platform where you can go and you can modify things as any human would before AI, then that is more helpful, right? So from a human in the loop standpoint and a feature standpoint, there are, many considerations. But the larger point is if you own all of this yourself and you can position yourself to be on top of these LLM companies and kind of these kinds of advancements, not only at the inference endpoints of the LLMs, but also the SDKs and the underlying sort of developer products, then you're in a much better place, right? From a pricing and a features and a control standpoint. As a thought leader in this space, what do you envision the role of AI in the... Oh, Donald, thank you. I'm hardly a thought leader. Just an engineer who, has a lot of coffee.
You got to give yourself credit. You got to give yourself credit.
So, well, I mean, there is one view that I think is very, very good and very true. And we see this with a university that we work with is the pro-presence argument. Okay, so let's say pro-human presence. So we've all been in meetings, for example, where we can have the AI take notes, right? And it seems like a stupid example, right? But if the AI is taking notes and we are not furiously laboring away at sort of trying to, transcribe what the speakers are saying, then we can be a little bit more present in the meeting without having to worry about losing context, okay? So there is, in the short term, AI, people are using it for cheating and so on. Okay, let's say this is the first, the first hurdle, okay? A few months from now, then let's say when this becomes commonplace, let's say at every college or every university, maybe it's a little bit more than that, right? But when systems like there's tutors and so on become commonplace at every college, just like every website that the colleges put out have little search engines. So, well, now you have your own little agents that can summarize over the notes, right? Nobody doubts that that's coming. And, not only text, but also voice, right? There is, interesting applications where you can have with screen sharing and so on, right? So to really augment the support. Okay, so when that's coming and this becomes, commonplace, then you say, okay, so what is the differentiator for me? It's like, well, now we can talk about sort of the human presence. If you have advisors that say, okay, well, some number of students are not even coming to me for help, they're taken care of with the self-serve solution, but now the advisors can focus in on the people who are really struggling, okay, which are now, correct me if I'm wrong, but a little bit underserved. Well, then that's an area where the pro-human presence is augmented, right? If you can use AI to, let's say, answer questions easily, right? For a student who works and cannot make the TA's office hours, okay? And that student can be, well, helped better, frankly, right? Or maybe this can work during the students, like, I don't know, maybe the student wants to work at 11 p.m. and now you have answers for the student at 11 p.m. Well, then you can have that student go to the next level of assessments and problems. So this is kind of what, and then maybe it seems obvious, right? But it's to really do what maybe the entire space was supposed to do from the very beginning, okay? And it seems as though, in a way, there were many avocados along the way, right? That we started to say, it's like, well, avocados, right? So of course I cannot provide any sort of degree of personalization. There are too many students and so on, right? And look at my schedule, it's super packed. Okay, that's true. But if we start to chomp them down, then that individual sort of expression of the human, right? The student, as well as the advisor, as well as the faculty, and so on, gets more driven forward. And it seems as though colleges will increasingly, go into that, right? There is, of course, you see all the trends, all the social trends, and so on, from from an anxiety standpoint and loneliness standpoint, like it's an absolute epidemic. And you're like, okay, well, why can we not use the colleges, right, to sort of help a little bit more with that, right? It's an environment where people are connected to each other, right? You can be building connections and friendships and relationships and all these kinds of things. And if you say, okay, well, it's because I'm very busy, but a lot of that busyness can be taken out, then great, then we have more time. There is that, those examples, and they're always controversial because there is some degree of truth, but then there's some degree of things that are not really voiced. But if you look at these K-12 schools, right, there, you've seen those stories about, let's say, Alpha School, for example, right, where maybe it's, for little kids, right, but that time of lecturing gets condensed into short time frames, and the rest of the time is devoted to people sort of working on projects. Then that is, that's better, right? And that's a little bit more efficient. So it requires us to sort of let go of that comfort of lecturing, of giving sort of the same material at large. But it gives us something greater. Like one little example, let's just say, so I studied computer science and electrical engineering. Okay. And if I take a differential equations course, and I did, right? But if I take a differential equations course, well, I'm doing it with, kids who are in mechanical and kids who are in chemical and kids who are in all kinds of other subjects. Whenever I ask a question about some differential equations or something like this, I cannot expect to get an answer about computer science and electrical engineering, even though that's what's most interesting to me, because the professor obviously has to strike some balance between tending to my own individual needs versus tending to the needs of the class at large. Well, what if I was the only student in that class, and every time I asked a question, I could follow it with my literal biography and my hopes and dreams and my interests and so on, right? That question would take forever, right? And it's ridiculous to even pose that for a human standpoint, but not so for an AI, right? For an AI, whenever a student is, let's say, asking a question, and here, I just ask, what are the key epidemiological, whatever, student designs, right? This is not what is getting sent to the language model. The language model is seeing this. It's also seeing the system prompt. It's also seeing the moderation layer. It's seeing a bunch of stuff, right? And the language model is taking that into account to provide an answer back to me. If that language model can also see what is my educational background and what am I interested in, maybe why am I asking this question, right? Then, okay, I can have a much greater degree of personalization. And something that was a little bit of a scam for a long time, like the adaptive learning, because it wasn't a scam, right? But it always presented kind of unattainable barriers. It's like, well, instead of having, 10 assignments, you must have 300 assignments, right? Or you must have the first however many thousands of students go through the course so we can determine some patterns before we can provide any meaningful statistical analysis. That is unattainable and ridiculous. With language models, you have that, that's a lot more accessible. I ask a question, but with my question, I'm going to append a bunch of other stuff, right? Which in this case, for sure, can be my biography. And then the response from the language model is going to be actually personalized, right? So that's pretty cool, right? Because if it provides a personalized example and I can get through through learning a little bit faster, my motivation levels are increased and so on, then, that's very cool. So that's where we would say. And then you're like, okay, well, why cannot you have one course per student in a classroom today? Okay, ridiculous question, because the professor doesn't have time to create one course per student. Okay, so, well, I learn better by hearing stuff, right? Or I don't know, if I take a psychometric test that reveals how I learn best, well, that's how maybe I should have all the material delivered to me. The college says that is ridiculous. Sorry, you're going to have maybe a textbook, maybe the website, maybe this. We're not going to just determine everything according to your psychometric needs. Like that is, sorry, there's no bandwidth. Well, why not? Maybe now there is, right? So that super personalization, which in the past maybe was kind of unattainable, now is pretty attainable. And everybody can reproduce this by going to ChatGPT and just extending the prompt, right? When they ask a question. So you're like, all right, well, what is the gap between that and then just putting a lot of that information in a database that I can, surface whenever a student asks a question? But that's that. And then I would, so Matthew, yeah, there was a time where the instructor was the source of knowledge along with the book. Now they're the facilitator of the knowledge rather than the source. I mean, this goes a little bit, a little bit over my skis in a way, right? But I think there's a more ambitious role for the instructor rather than just the avocados, right? And if you have a student, right, who is motivated, who can go a lot deeper, right, then those constraints of, okay, well, the rest of your peers don't maybe share your, I don't know, they're just maybe in a different place, so we cannot go into that. Well, now maybe you can, right? And I would argue that when somebody, as a little child, right, says, okay, I want to become a professor, it's a lot more of that, right? That passion to really help people, that is the greater driving force versus the avocado. So that's maybe a little bit of a longer conversation, but I would advocate for that. Oh, thank you, David. And Brian, yes. So where can a student send a request in the chat history to a tutor? So this is something that can be configured each point, right? The instructor does have access to the chat history as well, right? But we can also say, okay, if the student says, okay, look, I really just want to speak to a human at this point, all right, then that is very feasible as well, right? And we can talk about sort of how that works, but it's easy. You basically have a tool with a relevant description, and that tool will get triggered and jump in whenever the student needs that. Zach, I'm a little concerned about calling textbook hyper-personalization attainable. It's an implicit assumption. So, okay, that is okay. So, Zach, that's fair. So, one, I would say, and this is, keep in mind, I'm answering these things like, let's say, a caffeinated engineer whose purpose is ultimately to build tools for you. Okay, so on a pedagogical level, right, you are the authority. But some things I would say to this is, you have ways to mitigate this problem, right? So one, if you see these little numbers right here, right, so this is saying that this is, let's say, 91% semantically similar to the question, okay, and to sort of to what the student has asked. So you could just anchor if you say, okay, well, I really only want to trust notebooks. I don't want to trust anything that's generative because, God knows where it's coming from. Okay, that can be anchored into your documents, and you could say, don't show me anything unless there is a 91 percent degree of semantic similarity. Like, you could have an application that does not rely on the LLM's database, so to speak. Like, the LLM is a reasoning engine, but it also has some data, right, from crawling so much stuff. So you could just say, I really only want to see things that are from the textbook. We had an application for a medical organization where they said, okay, if you generate any text and that's wrong, then, people are going to get hurt and it's going to be a massive problem. Okay. So all that this became was a semantic search interface. So between the user's question and what you can do semantic search, you can call semantic search AI, I guess, right? It's like kind of semantic search is I'm searching based on meaning, not keyword, right? Like, if I talk to you about Python, you don't know if I'm talking about a snake or a programming language unless I give you more context. If I give you more context, then you have enough to, see what's kind of semantically similar to that. So if you say, okay, pedagogically, from your standpoint, we're not going to output any answers unless they are literally cited in approved textbooks or the professor's notes, that is very possible, right? We just, toggle this semantic similarity threshold to the max, lower the temperature, okay? And that's okay. You don't have to be sort of in a scenario where you hallucinate. It's funny, the hallucination. Oh, thank you, Zach. But the hallucination is funny because sometimes, we had an application with a college. It was the least controversial job ever to replace. Okay, let's say, to put it in those terms, and it was the job of somebody who is just answering questions about how the LMS works. Okay, so that got fed the Blackboard documentation. Apparently, no one was competing for that job. That was an avocado that people just like to see out the door completely. So with that, people said, okay, well, I want to ask questions about the manual. Like, how do I export a course? Okay, there was an application where we had turned the temperature so low, and the temperature is a measure of this kind of like entropy, right? If you are, for example, doing a poetry course, maybe you wanted to, to be a little bit more excited, right? So you have a higher degree, a higher temperature. In this case, we're just referenced from LMS docs. Okay, so low temperature. Well, the temperature was so low that when you asked it to export a course, it didn't find any matches. It said, well, why not? Because in the documentation you had save matches. Okay, all right. So maybe the temperature could not be 0, right? Maybe it had to be like 0.1. So it would know that export a course means the same thing as save a course. So all of these are basically things that you basically start to toggle, right? Because they will depend on the applications, right? If it's something more technical versus if it's something in the humanities versus if it's something else. And as long as you have that control, and not you as kind of at the boss level, let's just say the faculty if you want, right? But as long as the faculty, and maybe the faculty is teaching a lot of courses, so maybe you want to have, well, maybe each course has its own settings, right? As long as you have that level of control, then that is, that's okay, and that's productive.
I'm going to lift up Michael as the final question of the event.
Yes, Michael, I would love to hear about your rate of adoption in schools and what you're working with currently. What percentage of students are taking advantage? So there is, so to answer that, there is, for example, here's our integration, how we really, if we can do it, how we like to do the integration with the LMSs, right? Which is by putting the mentors directly within them. Okay, if we do something like this, right, where the student doesn't have to be, like if we have the student either go out to our platform, or which is going to have, let's say, all the Socratic safeguards from the faculty, right, versus go to ChatGPT, and in that moment the student is tempted and tired and frankly maybe wants to cheat, okay, then that adoption is going to be lower, right? And those intentions from the faculty to sort of help the student a little bit are going to take a hit. If instead we say, okay, well, this mentors is going to be directly within the platform, then I mean, there's nothing that has been done on a wide study yet, right? But we've seen quite a few cases, right, where in this case there's a company, right, the engagement and the performance was doubled, right? And you're okay, well, that's productive. If the student instead has to wade through or maybe go to another URL or to do something else, then the adoption is much slower, right? Because they have the choice between just getting an answer or going through their faculty's, roadblocks. So, oh, thank you, John. So yeah, Michael, that's that. For the professors, it depends. So there are people, for example, who say, there's Juana Mendenhall, for example, right? So Juana Mendenhall, Dr. Juana Mendenhall, right? She's at Morehouse College, right? And she's excellent, right? There are, when for example, colleges do programs like this, where they say, okay, we're going to maybe put out this kind of proposal for a tutoring platform, right? And you're going to have control. You're going to be able to do these things that you cannot do elsewhere. And who's interested in participating? Okay, these kinds of programs have, they do very well, right? And they get sort of great buy-in, right, from the faculty. We don't do it in a way where it's like, okay, well, everybody is necessarily mandated, or technically the college is in charge of that, right? We just provide the platform. We don't really see colleges doing that, mandating that, because there are a lot of sort of concerns that people have that are best addressed rather than just, mandated from the top. But if you say, okay, well, we're going to pilot something like this, right? And it doesn't have to be our platform. Like you see, I mean, there are others, right? But we're going to take a look at something like this, and who is interested in doing it, then people, when faculty say, okay, so I'm interested, what does that entail? It's like, well, you're going to get trained, right? You're going to we're going to work with you one-on-one, right? To build these mentors for you. You're not going to be thrown into the deep end, okay? And you're going to have that opportunity to sort of, let's say, lead this from the front and frankly demystify a lot of concerns that I would be scared if I didn't know the answers to as well, right? Then that really helps a lot. And then those faculty, well, they do quite well. I think it may be a little bit early to talk about percentages, right? Because if we talk about the you know, the percentages of basically every university is different, right? And it depends on how it is. But from a convenience standpoint, I want to show you, you know, this is another perception, another faculty, right? And sort of their perception. It's really, once sort of it's demystified and people are trained on it, and they have that kind of control, and they weigh it against the reality, which is that, let's say 90% of my students are on ChatGPT. By the way, that denominator is important, because some people are saying, oh, well, I either like AI or no. Okay, that's okay, right? But that's not really the question. The question is, your students are in ChatGPT. Do you want them to be instead on something that you control a little bit more, right? And if all of that messaging and the onboarding and so on, and the access from the LMS as opposed to waiting out to another platform, if all of those pieces fall together well, then, you know, I don't know, the adoption is high, right? But yeah. So
well, this was great, Miguel. I appreciate you.
thank you.
We didn't hear from Jeremy. I don't know if he was gonna pop on or not, but okay. But this was awesome. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. But thank you so much. I appreciate it. You know, if folks want to get a hold of you or talk to you more about this, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you guys?
Oh, just my email, Miguel at IBLAI.
All right, perfect.